So to talk a little bit more about day one proceedings and of course what's to come tomorrow when the summit actually kicks off, I'm joined on the broadcast by Einar Tangen. He's a political and economic commentator joining us from China, while Professor Swaran Singh of the School of International Studies at the prestigious Jawaharlal Nehru University also joins us on the broadcast. Gentlemen, good evening. Thank you both for making time. Professor Singh, do you feel that the Wuhan summit and, of course, Prime Minister Modi's comments on China at the Shangri-La dialogue sort of underpinned today's interaction between the two leaders of India and China?
You are right. After United States has followed America First policy, both in Europe and also in Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific, leaders are really recalibrating their relations amongst themselves. And I think that is clearly visible in now the triangle that we can notice of President Putin and President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi. In fact, President Putin has already said that Russia, China, India are now three major players in Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which after entry of India and Pakistan has become world's largest regional organization. India is the second largest country, second largest economy, fastest growing economy. So it, I think, also brings a certain responsibility and expectations from India as we participate in Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And I think there is a possibility of complementarities because priorities of India and priorities of nations of Shanghai Cooperation Organization overlap a great deal. And as you just mentioned, after Wuhan, there is talk of reset of China-India relationship. And the two MOUs signed today in Qingdao is I think, quite an improvement, because if you recall last year during Doklam, Chinese had refused to supply us the hydrological data. Now this agreement goes back to 2002, and every 5 years this has been revived. So in March this year, you had the mechanism of experts meeting again and reviving, and I think this is another extension now we got in 2018.
Right.
Likewise, the fundamental issue of trade deficit is supposed to be tackled by improving India's agricultural-related exports, rice, sugar, cotton, soybean, and I think here another MOU for, improvising the non-basmati exports of rice of India, and of course, possibility of some discussion of pharmaceuticals and IT to address this problem of deficit in China-India relations. So This was very clearly focused on bilaterals today. We will see the multilateral part of it tomorrow.
Absolutely. Before we get into that, though, let me go across to Einar as well. Einar, speaking about the relationship between India and China post Wuhan, that is really the key word now. After it being post Doklam, it's moved to post Wuhan, and there has been growing acrimony between the United States and China. Do you think that this was an interesting moment, perhaps, in which both countries demonstrated that their relationship is going to stay independent of, let's say, global pushes and pulls?
Well, I would agree with that statement. I think Modi is being very careful to balance relationships. You'll note that he has met with President Trump, Xi Jinping, and also Putin. And he's being very, very careful. He's got some very nice concessions. You'll note that both MOUs were in India's favor. There's nothing in it really for China other than to create better relationship. But going further down the line, I think what we have here is an opportunity for India and China to work together. As you pointed out, and as Professor Singh said, the two largest economies, fastest growing economies, Europe and the United States still have 60% of the world's wealth. But where can they invest it where they can get a return other than India and China? And I think there's real opportunities there. China is at a phase right now, which I explain as a 15-15-15. It's $15 a day to an hour to employ somebody for basic assembly work in the United States, $15 a day to employ somebody in China, and it's $15 a week to do it in some place like India. So there are obviously a lot of industries that will be moving from China, and India would be the primary place, a great place for them to go, as long as there's connectivity. I think putting all these things together, you could see a real change in the bilateral trade that goes on between these countries.
Right, and the ripple effect will be felt across the world, I suppose. Professor Singh, this summit also comes on the back of a number of personal interactions that have taken place. I'm talking about, of course, Prime Minister Modi meeting President Xi, but also there was the Sochi summit. There was also President Putin receiving the Friendship Medal from China, a first in itself. Do you think that these personal relationships and personal chemistry are also going to underpin what happens at the multilateral fora starting tomorrow?
You're right. I think we are noticing a whole new genre of summit diplomacy, where these are largely informal meetings. And you understand today, Chinese have accepted that President Xi Jinping will also come to India next year for a similar informal summit meeting. No advisors, no officials, no agenda, and no expectations of outcomes, to fundamentally focus on the personal camaraderie and understanding and trust of these important leaders of these major powers of Asia Pacific. And that's a new genre that we are noticing. I think that will also be now increasingly visible in Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where you have this, the whole focus on Shanghai spirit, something like we have been seeing in ASEAN way that has been guiding the ASEAN meetings and interactions so far. And in some ways, it sort of reminds us of the Panchsheel Agreement and the Panchsheel 5 principles that also talked of mutual respect and sort of common development as sort of a focus of building interstate relations, in those era. And now we have Shanghai spirit. So this is, I think, a new innovation and a new genre of diplomacy of major leaders of Asia. And some of them is really on a good display, because it's not just in closed-door meetings, but repeated display. And you saw today President Xi Jinping accompanying President Putin on the train.
Yes.
These are gestures where they're really indulging with each other, showcasing the close friendship. And I think that we will see more and more, because Prime Minister Modi, President Xi Jinping, and President Vladimir Putin are going to meet 4 more times in this year alone. So there's going to be repeated meetings. And these multilateral meetings are a good setting because they have common understanding of several regional and global issues. And that brings in a positive spin-off impact on the bilateral issues. So I think in long run, this is going to be a good fundamental tectonical change in how we will address bilateral relations.
Right. I'll request both Professor Singh and Ainar to stay with me a while longer, because even though India and China's bilateral ties took a nosedive during the Doklam standoff, the Indian Prime Minister and Xi Jinping's personal chemistry, as Professor Singh was referring to, has grown from strength to strength. Here's a look now at the meetings that have taken place between the two leaders since 2014.
This bilateral meeting between the two leaders from India and China is the 11th such meeting in the last 4 years. Just last month, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi met Xi Jinping in Wuhan. The two leaders made waves when they took a boat ride on the picturesque East Lake in Wuhan. The informal meeting saw no signing of agreements, but was seen as a sign of reset in ties between India and China. But the meeting that everyone had their eyes on was the BRICS summit in September 2017. It was vital as it followed the 73-day standoff along the line of actual control in Doklam. It was also the first time that China did not object to the listing of Pakistani-based Jaish-e-Mohammed, Lashkar-e-Toiba and the Haqqani network as international terror groups. 2 months before that, there was tense exchange in Hamburg in Germany. The two leaders met on the sidelines of the G20 summit, but did not hold any bilateral meetings. On June 9, 2017, Modi and Xi had a brief exchange on the sidelines of the SCO Summit. But the atmosphere was tense following India's move to decline the invitation to a Belt and Road Initiative summit hosted by Beijing. India hosted the Chinese President in October 2016, when he was attending the BRICS summit in Goa. The two countries held fruitful discussions on issues including terrorism, India's NSG membership, and enhancing trade and investment. But the months preceding this meeting were marked by bitterness and acrimony. In the G20 summit held in China in 2016, the two countries shared an uneasy relationship. The two Asian giants had been on a downward spiral over China vetoing India's petitions to ban Jaish-e-Mohammed chief Masood Azhar in the UN Security Council. India also objected to China's multi-billion-dollar China-Pakistan economic corridor that runs through Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. China also continued to block India's NSG bid. despite repeated petitions from India, including the one made in June 2016 at the Tashkent SCO Summit. The first time Modi visited China after taking over as the Prime Minister was in 2015, when he became the first world leader to be hosted by Xi at his hometown. In what was seen as rare chemistry, Xi and Modi were seen walking hand in hand and chatting amicably in front of the cameras. But what made headlines from that visit was Modi's selfie with a Chinese premier. It was touted as one of the most power-packed selfies in history and garnered over 31 million views on Chinese microblogging site Weibo. But the ties between the two nations began the year Narendra Modi was elected as the Indian Prime Minister. Xi Jinping was hosted by Modi in Ahmedabad and not in Delhi, which is where any head of state would be hosted. Xi became the first Chinese leader in 6 decades to be feted at a public reception. A budding bonhomie between the two world leaders was on full display when they took a stroll along the Sabarmati riverfront and sat side by side on a swing. Narendra Modi and Xi Jinping have shared a bittersweet relationship over the last 4 years. But now, as the two countries try to hit the reset button, the warmth between Modi and Xi is only growing. Bureau Report, WION.
Right, so Ainar Tangen, Professor Swaran Singh and journalist Gaurav Sharma are also on the broadcast with me right now to talk more about the SCO Summit, which is underway. Gaurav, I'll come to you first. The fact that 2 pacts were signed today, 2 memoranda of understanding between India and China, setting the pace perhaps for maybe not tomorrow's interactions on the multilateral fora, so to speak, but at least in terms of India and China's growing economic relationship as well.
Yeah, you have to see that this is, I think I would say the Foreign Secretary, India's Foreign Secretary made some major announcement. And you see, China and India have decided a trade target of $100 billion by 2020. We all are aware of the yawning trade deficit between India and China. But, you see it was a big announcement. And if you see, Chinese side, since the Foreign Secretary Vijay Gokhale also said that Chinese side will also encourage pharmaceutical products from India, which was quite a prickly issue between India and China, because Indian pharmaceutical companies have been trying for a major push in the Chinese market, and there was no access to it. So this is a very, very big announcement. And also that Prime Minister Narendra Modi saying that, okay, India is okay with the presence of Bank of China. This is also a major announcement in terms of trade. And Mr. Xi Jinping is going to visit India in 2019. Something it was, I think I'm not surprised, and no one will be surprised, because he was already invited by Narendra Modi in the Wuhan Summit. So he actually accepted this, something which is a major announcement. And flurry, in fact, ministerial meets, public security, the China's Public Security Bureau Minister and Defense Minister, they will be meeting, they will be coming to New Delhi, they'll be going to New Delhi and will have a dialogue with their counterparts.
Right, and I suppose this sort of punctuates this growing relationship that we're talking about. But Ainar, to move beyond just, the relationship between India and China, I want to talk broad strokes now about the summit itself. It's coming at a time when there's another summit taking place elsewhere in the Western Hemisphere. That one is called the G7, but is being called the G6+1. Would you agree that this seems to be a situation where we're seeing a resurgent Asia coming together and a divided West, which is squabbling over things like trade tariffs and, of course, not being able to find middle ground on anything as far as, far as Iran goes, or even climate change?
Well, I think that's an excellent synopsis, but I would add one more thing, that there's a personal element into it. No one could imagine, nor has it ever happened, that Xi Jinping made light of Modi's accent, as President Trump did. And this is a very important aspect of strongman politics that now seems to dominate along the world. You cannot make fun of somebody, you cannot disrespect them or their country, you cannot use harsh words towards them. And I think that's something that the Chinese have a little bit better handle on than Donald Trump at this point. So going forward, yes, there is this sense that the West is kind of falling apart. The question is, where will Europe go? Remember, the true competitors in the West are Europe and the United States. Both produce everything the other one produces. If you want a Boeing plane or you want an Airbus plane, if you want a GE medical device, or you can have a Siemens device. So they're true competitors. If, in fact, Europe decides to separate from the U.S., there could be a major change in terms of the trade dollar hegemony. And if that happens, it could bring about a new era where markets, especially, as I've said before, India and China will have a much stronger position in terms of being at the negotiating table and saying what they need, just as opposed to saying that they have to be open to whoever wants to come in.
Absolutely. Professor Singh, is that a view that you endorse as well, that we are going to see the coming together of Asian giants in a big way going forward, especially if the animosity and acrimony between Western powers continues as it is right now at the G7?
I agree with Anna Tangen that there is a certain feeling of disconcertment among the G7 countries, especially recently. You noticed that imposition of tariffs has created a lot of irritation between allies of United States with United States. There are security concerns as well. You see, Shinzo Abe recently visited United States to make sure Donald Trump doesn't extend that nuclear umbrella to North Korea in his meeting. So there is a little distrust evolving in Western allies, especially with the United States now. So European states are trying increasingly to behave autonomous of United States. But another interesting part is that the SCO 8, as I would call them now, are emerging. So there is a certain amount of enthusiasm to do new things and sort of chart their own course independent of either United States or European powers. So I think that enthusiasm is very different compared to the negative vibes that one can notice in G7 meeting. In that sense, I think there is a certain amount of expectation then from the three big states, Russia, China and India, and particularly from China and India, because these are rising economies, and I think economics is really being recognized as element of power in future. And prosperity is what is really important for citizens who are now focused on global policies and national policies. In that sense, India is calibrating its engagement both with its partners in Western alliance, if you want to call them, and also engaging Russia and China simultaneously. So I think in that sense, it's a careful calibration that India has had so far. But within that, we notice a little drift now in favor of China and Russia, and Shanghai Cooperation Organization being one and BRICS being another. So India is really engaging these states far more seriously in building bigger economic partnerships with them, building complementarities with Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS. And that, I think, is something which is going to emerge far more influential and far more integral part of Indian foreign policy. And the personal element of relationship that Indian Prime Minister is building with these leaders is really, I think, showcasing the kind of new way of organizing interstate relations and increasing discomfort with the United States,
right.
Especially with the new law that was passed in August this year, which is really influencing India's procurements, even with Russia. I think that is going to create further irritation in the relationship.
Right.
But I think there's a little drift that is noticeable away from United States and in favor of China and Russia in India's foreign policy.
And that was a big concern when President Trump became the United States commander-in-chief, that it's going to cause ripples across the world. And they continue even now, though it's been almost a year and a half since he took charge of the White House. We'll have to leave it at that, gentlemen. Thank you all for taking out the time to speak with us. Professor Singh, Aina Tangen and Gaurav Sharma. We're wrapping up that particular segment of the broadcast on that note.